Hi, Andrew. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Andrew Ye is joining us to talk about the TikTok issue currently affecting the US. Andrew is the executive director of the China Strategic Risks Institute, and so I imagine you've been following this quite closely.
Yeah, for sure. It's a super interesting issue for us. The US has been toying with the idea of banning TikTok for some time in various forms and guises. The latest initiative seemed like the most serious and most feasible attempt so far. So we've been following it with great interest.
And so, what is the problem with TikTok? Why does the US want to ban it?
So there's a number of concerns here. Broadly speaking, they fall into two buckets. One is around data security, and the other is around misinformation or propaganda. So in terms of data security, well, firstly, TikTok, like most social media apps, collects a huge amount of data, both in terms of how users behave on the platform, but also in terms of the characteristics of the user, whether that's their age, their name, but also their IP address, location data. And particularly for TikTok as well, it reserves the right to collect biometric data. So, for example, analyzing facial features of those who upload content onto their app. And then, of course, also collecting data or having access to data such as messages between users and what is actually being posted on the platform itself. So there's a huge amount of data that TikTok has access to. And then because of China's national intelligence law, which grants the Chinese government the right to request any kind of data from its companies, whether they are operating within China or outside of China, and that means that effectively, if it wants to, the Chinese government can also have access to that same level of data. And knowing that the Chinese government engages proactively in surveillance, particularly of the Chinese diaspora abroad in places like the US, but also more generally monitoring political activity relevant to China globally, and knowing that also China takes great effort to try and understand where its critics are and intimidate its critics. There's lots of reasons why China may have an interest in accessing some of this data that TikTok holds. So that's the data security point. In terms of propaganda and misinformation, the question is whether TikTok, by virtue of its close links to the Chinese government, might be censoring certain information that is critical of China, or similarly might be spreading disinformation or propaganda that is working in China's interests or promoting positive information about China. Again, there is rationale behind these issues. So, for example, on Douyin, which is the Chinese version of TikTok, so still owned by ByteDance, which is the parent company, we know that censorship is regularly carried out on that platform. There have been issues around content related to human rights abuses in the Uyghur region being censored in and outside of China. TikTok claims now to have corrected those issues, but the risk is very much there. And then, of course, the Chinese government has, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, carried out a campaign not only on TikTok, but also on other social media platforms such as Twitter, to promote certain messages about the US. So, for example, promoting this idea that the US, that COVID may have originated in the US, and other messages which it sees as favourable to China. So, taken together, that does raise the risk that potentially TikTok could be used in a way to spread misinformation propaganda as well.
And so the issue is that China owns ByteDance. So how much, what percentage of stake do they own? How much influence do they actually have over the company?
Yeah, so I mean, the Chinese state actually only owns 1% of ByteDance, which might seem like a fairly insignificant number, but the influence goes much deeper. So as well as having to comply with China's national intelligence law, as we discussed earlier, there are also requirements around the level of access that the Chinese Communist Party has to Chinese companies. So, for example, ByteDance, one of its 3 board members is a member of the Chinese Communist Party, so the Chinese government can exert considerable influence there. And then large companies like ByteDance are also required to have Chinese Communist Party branches within the organization. which can also exert influence over key decisions such as recruitment, the strategic direction of the company, and also have access to key information that the company might hold as well. So there are many levers, both legal and informal, which the Chinese government can pull if it ever needed to bring ByteDance into line. And specifically with regards to the tech sector, in recent years, we've seen the Chinese government really try and crack down on the tech sector and bring it back into line. So I would imagine that if you were an executive at ByteDance, you'd be very sensitive to what the Chinese government wants and how your company can fit into the Chinese government strategy.
Yeah, and as you said, there's a legal requirement for ByteDance to hand over any and all data that's requested by the Chinese state, isn't there? TikTok have claimed that they've ring-fenced US data, personal data, and that it's not accessible by any Chinese entity. Do you think that's true?
Well, we know that in the past there have been instances where that ring fencing clearly has not taken place. Recent instance, for example, where Chinese employees or TikTok's employees in China have been able to attempt to track down journalists who were reporting on TikTok, looking at their IP addresses to try and work out whether some of TikTok's own employees were actually leaking information to these journalists or not. So there clearly are issues in terms of that data not being sufficiently ring-fenced, or there not being a strict enough firewall between the data on US users and what staff TikTok and ByteDance's staff within China can access.
And my understanding is that even if ByteDance sold its the Chinese government's stake in the business, that they would still have to have a Chinese party member on the board. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. I think the state is the 1% stake held by the state is relatively inconsequential. What's much more important is, firstly, the requirement to comply under Chinese law, and secondly, the degree of influence within the companies that the Chinese Communist Party can influence.
Do you think it's possible for TikTok to operate safely in the US, or do you think there's just too much Chinese influence, Chinese governmental influence, and in fact this entire business is just too risky?
I mean, I think what I would say is that these problems, both data security and propaganda and misinformation, are a huge problem for TikTok, and many of these concerns are exacerbated by TikTok, but they're not limited to TikTok. So, for example, if we look at Twitter, well, we know that the Chinese government attempts to spread disinformation and promote propaganda on Twitter. We might have fewer concerns about Twitter in terms of whether its leadership actively wants to or sees a strategic advantage in doing that. But, those concerns around disinformation are still there. And then if we look at data security, well, China's national intelligence law doesn't just apply to TikTok, it applies to any Chinese company. So any Chinese company which is collecting data on citizens abroad, whether in the US or elsewhere, could also potentially come under this law. So, for example, if you have a smart doorbell which collects camera footage, that data is potentially data which could be accessed by the Chinese government if it's owned by a Chinese company. If we look at the electric vehicle sector, for example, electric vehicles also collect huge amounts of data on user behavior, but also in terms of location tracking and so on. And again, if that's a Chinese firm, then that could also be accessed by the Chinese government. So I think, while there are arguments for specifically focusing on TikTok because TikTok is so popular and so massive and so influential, there is a much broader debate around data security and misinformation with regards to China that needs to be had.
And I suppose the risk posed to anyone, government or not, who is producing any pushback against or sort of content. Like, I'm thinking of journalists who are writing articles that perhaps the Chinese state don't agree with and want to push back on, which is what you mentioned earlier. They were accessing a journalist's data to try and determine who their contacts were, who their sources were, right? Which is, terrifying. So what do you think is going to happen in the US? Do you think there seems to be this is one of the few issues where there is bipartisan support in the US. Do you think that goes far enough in the Senate? Do you think this could pass?
Yeah, I think it could. There does seem to be bipartisan support. I think there's certain levels of disagreement about who has the power to add new companies. Does that power lie with the president or does it lie elsewhere? Because of course, as you said earlier, it's not just TikTok. There is the potential other companies to be added to this list as well. There'll be some within Congress who would quite happily see other Chinese companies added to the list, and there would be others who would be very keen to restrict it just to TikTok. I think there will be questions around the wider impact this has on the tech sector in the US and the wider impact this has in terms of the willingness of foreign technology companies to be involved in the US market. So there may be an effort to reassure businesses and reassure investors that this is a piece of legislation that is going to be used specifically just for TikTok rather than generally across the board. I think there's definitely a lot of support for this in the US at the moment.
That's I suppose reassuring. If it did pass the Senate, do you see any potential diplomatic fallout between China and the US? What could happen there?
Yeah, so the Chinese government doesn't want to sell TikTok. It doesn't want generally to allow technology that the Chinese companies and the Chinese government has developed to fall into US hands. Obviously, with TikTok, we might not be talking about some of the most strategically important technologies, so it's not the end of the world for the Chinese government if the sale does go ahead. But I think it would be a major falling out. I think also there are certain reputational risks for the US here, which need to be considered. So the US prides itself on being a free environment for the media, of allowing freedom of expression. It quite rightly criticizes the Chinese government for banning websites such as Facebook and YouTube within China. It quite rightly criticizes the Chinese government for banning apps such as WhatsApp and other end-to-end encryption. Yeah, indeed, in China itself. So I think there's a certain risk that the US could be portrayed by China or others as having some double standards here in terms of banning TikTok.
And in terms of the electoral repercussions, do you think there could be any there? Obviously, Trump who initially suggested this was his idea, I suppose. He's changed his mind. Biden's been the one to really push it through. However, the Democrats are worried that it might alienate the youth and reduce the youth vote, which is something the Democrats have been pushing. Do you think this could potentially have any significant impact on the election?
Yeah, I think that there would be a lot of disappointed young people if this does go ahead. And I think data security is not something that most voters think about. And so it would come as quite surprising, I think, to a lot of voters. And the question would be, would there have been a way to achieve the same result without having such an obvious impact? So, for example, really strengthening legislation around the disincentives for TikTok to share data back to China, strengthening fines, strengthening punishment and enforcement, as well as broader efforts to deal with misinformation and propaganda on social media outlets, not just TikTok. Measures in that direction rather than specifically targeted at TikTok might have avoided this situation. But I can see how, many voters who are perhaps not following the geopolitics, not following data security issues so closely, might be quite surprised and shocked and see this as politicking where it's not welcome.
And do you think, looking more internationally, do you think this is something that other countries or regional blocs might consider doing? I'm thinking the EU, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Do you think this is something that, if it happens in the US, that they would consider doing as well?
So a number of countries have followed the US in banning government employees from having TikTok on their phones. So there is an awareness of the data security issue. What I would hope on the European front, both in the UK and the EU, is that there is a greater awareness of how these two issues, data security and censorship and propaganda, are much greater than just TikTok alone. In Europe, we've recently strengthened data protection laws around GDPR, but actually data flows to China are a huge huge blind spot or a huge vulnerability within that relatively stringent regime. So again, it's not just TikTok, it's also electric vehicles, it's also surveillance cameras. Where does this data end up if it's being held by Chinese firms? This is a huge question that we need to deal with, and there needs to be a way of legislating and regulating for this that takes into account all Chinese companies and not just TikTok. And then in terms of disinformation propaganda, well, it's not. I mean, it's not just China. We've also seen Russia in particular exploiting this in Europe. So again, there needs to be a way to encourage social media platforms to be able to identify and stop the spread of disinformation, and particularly ensuring they don't have algorithms which actively promote or actively bring to the fore those messages.
And apologies if this is too technical, but my understanding is that the EU has much better privacy laws, and I'm thinking GDPR, than the US does. Is this something that China would ever recognize as a legitimate reason to not share data? I don't see the Chinese state being too happy or curtailing down to GDPR standards, as it were, because obviously, according to that, they wouldn't be able to send the personal data outside of the EU.
Yeah, I think it's not a concept that the Chinese government would recognize. The Chinese government does have a concept of data privacy and data security, but the role of the state is very central to that, and the ability of the Chinese state to access data when needed is always consistent within Chinese legislation. So no, I don't think the Chinese government would be persuaded. I think the key would be making the incentives align for Chinese firms operating in Europe to the extent that they have a very strong disincentive against sending data back to China, and a strong incentive to maintain strict firewalls around data. I think there will always be questions about how certain you can be that those firewalls are working, particularly when the Chinese government can exert so much control over its companies. But I think that would be a good first step.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. I very much appreciate your time. And well, let's see what happens next. It's going to be an interesting few weeks, I think.
For sure. Thank you, Katie. Thank you.